When a man appeared at the entrance of a remote hospital in New Mexico in the late summer of 2019, he was barely recognizable, barefoot, emaciated to the point of being skeletal, with long, tangled hair and beard, and draped in tattered, rough scraps of fabric in place of clothing. The man had been missing for 5 years, along with his classmate during a research trip in Chaco Canyon, one of the most isolated and inaccessible areas on U.S. federal land, where both had been officially declared dead. But what chilled the doctors and investigators to the bone was not his appearance. The most terrifying part was what he said about those 5 years. About the place where they had been held, about the fate of the friend who never emerged from the canyon, and about what had existed in the darkness of Chaco Canyon all that time without anyone knowing. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. Chaco Canyon is located in the northwestern part of New Mexico. It is a vast desert valley surrounded by steep sandstone mesa cliffs where ancient trail systems, narrow canyons, and expansive empty plateaus create a landscape that is both majestic and brutally harsh. The area is far from major population centers, cell service is unreliable, and access roads are mostly long dirt tracks stretching for tens of miles, easily cut off by bad weather, making travel and communication almost entirely dependent on prior planning and preparation. In the early summer of 2014, 2 graduate archaeology students arrived at Chaco Canyon under a legally issued research permit from the National Park Service with the goal of surveying prehistoric architectural structures located outside the officially excavated sites in support of their theses and a university-affiliated academic project. Both had extensive field experience, having participated in numerous surveys in harsh environments, and had properly registered their stay at the researcher housing near the park's edge. According to the itinerary submitted to park management, they were to remain in the area for 7 days, traveling along predetermined routes each day and returning before dark to avoid risks from nighttime temperatures and poor visibility terrain. On the day of the incident, they left their lodging early in the morning, carrying water, recording equipment, a handheld GPS, and were expected to return by late afternoon after completing measurements in an area a few miles south of the starting point. The last confirmed activity was their stop at an automated information station in the park around midday, where the system recorded their pass cards. After that, no further images or data showed them appearing at any other checkpoints. By early evening, when the 2 students failed to return as planned, the lodging staff attempted to contact them via phone and internal radio, but received no response. Their families, accustomed to receiving daily safety confirmation messages, were also unable to reach them despite repeated attempts over several hours. As night fell and all communication efforts failed, park management began reviewing the registration log and submitted itinerary, confirming that the 2 students had no plans to overnight in the field. Faced with the risk of an accident in Chaco Canyon's harsh environmental conditions, a decision was made late that evening to notify park rangers and local authorities, officially filing a missing persons report for the 2 archaeology students, marking the moment the case shifted from a routine survey to an unresolved emergency situation. Once the missing persons report was forwarded to the National Park Service Coordination Center for Northwest New Mexico, the information was immediately processed according to standard procedures for lost contact cases in national parks, with an initial case file opened based on data provided by the lodging management and the students' families. Duty officers quickly reviewed the victims' identities, confirming both were adults over 21, with clear backgrounds, no criminal records, enrolled in graduate archaeology programs, and with multiple prior field surveys in similarly remote areas like Chaco Canyon. Records showed they had arrived at the park in a personal vehicle, possessed a valid research permit, had submitted a detailed itinerary to management, and showed no signs of rule violations or unauthorized entry into restricted areas. Based on this information, authorities initially assessed that the 2 students did not belong to vulnerable groups, were not minors, showed no indications of intentional flight, and were not connected to any known legal disputes or security threats. The preliminary analysis focused on the possibility of an accident, getting lost, or a medical emergency during travel, especially given Chaco Canyon's reputation for deep canyons, open plateaus and trails that can easily cause disorientation without clear landmarks. The lack of communication signals for several hours was considered consistent with the area's weak coverage, and their failure to return to lodging on schedule was classified as a risk situation but not yet sufficient to suspect criminal activity. Per operational classification, the case was recorded as a missing persons incident with no initial criminal indicators, falling under the missing persons non-criminal category, allowing agencies to prioritize search and rescue resources rather than immediately launching a criminal investigation. Officers also quickly reviewed the day's weather history, noting high daytime temperatures but not exceeding dangerous thresholds for properly prepared individuals, while nighttime temperatures could drop sharply, increasing the risk of hypothermia if stranded outdoors. Following standard procedure, information about the planned route, starting point, return time, and equipment carried was compiled into a preliminary search map to serve as the basis for subsequent decisions. In internal discussions among rangers, local police and park management representatives, quick consensus was reached that any delay in initiating a search could significantly reduce the chances of finding the victims alive if they had encountered trouble, especially in an environment as harsh and remote as Chaco Canyon. Therefore, despite the absence of any signs of crime or violence, a decision was made that night to activate an initial-scale search operation, including mobilizing on-duty ranger teams, preparing vehicles to access main trails, and notifying neighboring support units. The case file was updated to emergency status, officially marking the transition from a routine lost contact report to an organized search campaign, with the primary objective of locating the two students and assessing their safety as quickly as possible. On the very first night after the decision to launch the search, rangers and local police established the initial search perimeter based entirely on the itinerary the two students had previously registered with park management, treating it as the most reliable foundation in the absence of any field clues. The area map was spread out at the coordination center, with main trails, cross-plateau routes, side canyons, and planned survey points marked in detail, forming a fan-shaped search zone originating from the lodging and gradually expanding southward, where they were scheduled to conduct measurements that day. The initial search perimeter was limited to a radius of a few miles from the starting point, based on the assumption that if an incident had occurred, the students were most likely still within a reasonable one-day survey travel range. Search teams were assigned in small groups, each responsible for a specific sector to ensure no overlap and no omissions, combining experienced terrain rangers, local police, and some basic trained search and rescue volunteers. One group focused on checking main trails and commonly used intersections, while others swept low-lying areas, side canyons, and locations prone to slip-and-fall accidents. The search operation began early the next morning to take advantage of daylight, when temperatures were still tolerable and visibility was better. But from the very first hours, Chaco Canyon's environmental factors quickly revealed major challenges. The wide-open yet landmark-scarce terrain made navigation difficult. The continuous sandstone plateaus complicated the detection of human traces, and the narrow canyons with hard rock floors did not easily retain footprints or drag marks. The weather on the first search day was intensely sunny, with temperatures rising rapidly by midday, forcing teams to adjust their pace to avoid heat exhaustion and limiting time spent in areas without shade. A steady but light wind blew across the open plateaus, strong enough to blur or quickly erase small signs such as shoe prints in fine sand or dry soil, making any potential clues increasingly fragile over time. Despite the search teams moving according to plan, carefully sweeping every segment of trail, clearing, and natural turnoff, the results obtained throughout the first day were virtually zero. No backpacks were found, no abandoned equipment, no signs of a temporary shelter, nor any items indicating the two students had stopped or encountered trouble within the search area. The absence of human traces also meant it was impossible to determine the next direction of travel, forcing authorities to stick to the established perimeter rather than expand immediately. As the sun began to set and temperatures dropped rapidly toward the end of the day, search teams were forced to return to the staging point for safety, carrying a heavy sense of frustration after a long day's work with no concrete results. The end-of-day report noted that all planned trails and survey areas within the initial perimeter had been checked without detecting any direct signs related to the two students, while emphasizing that the terrain and environmental conditions of Chaco Canyon made the search heavily dependent on luck in the absence of initial clues. Nevertheless, field commanders maintained the assessment that the lack of discoveries on day one did not yet rule out the possibility that the victims remained in the area, given the complex terrain and high likelihood of traces being obscured. Therefore, the search plan would continue based on the established perimeter until new data emerged strong enough to justify changing the approach. On the second day of the search, after the initial range had been thoroughly combed without results, the authorities decided to expand operations in an indirect direction, focusing on checking areas accessible by motorized vehicles that the two students might have used before beginning to move on foot, especially the small, unofficial parking spots along the dirt roads leading into the park. During this sweep, a ranger team discovered a small pickup truck parked at the edge of a clearing several miles from the lodging area. The location was outside the recommended parking zone for researchers and did not match the registered starting point in the original survey plan. The license plate was quickly cross-checked with records, confirming that this was indeed the vehicle the two students had used to travel during their stay at Chaco Canyon. The fact that the vehicle appeared in a location not on the planned route was immediately noted as a significant detail, as it indicated that the two students had altered their travel plan at some point before losing contact without notifying park management. Upon approaching the vehicle, authorities conducted a preliminary inspection to ensure no one was inside, and there were no immediate signs of danger, then documented that the truck was still locked, with no signs of forced entry or collision. Inside the vehicle, several personal items were found, including spare clothing, some unused food, and everyday essentials, all neatly organized, showing no signs of haste or disturbance. Notably, critical field survey equipment, such as specialized backpacks, field notebooks, and handheld GPS devices, were not present in the vehicle, consistent with the assumption that the two students had taken them when they left the vehicle to begin the day's work. However, leaving the vehicle in this location was inconsistent with the registered plan, as the distance from here to the intended survey area was greater and would require walking through more complex terrain that researchers would typically avoid without a special reason. Around the parking area, search teams conducted a thorough ground sweep of the surrounding areas to look for signs indicating the direction of further travel, but the hard-packed soil, mixed with fine sand, combined with wind and weather effects, made identifying footprints extremely difficult. No clear shoe prints were found, no signs of dragging, no scattered items along nearby natural paths, and no evidence that the two students had set up a temporary camp or lingered for an extended period around the area where the vehicle was discovered. The fact that the vehicle was left stationary in a location inconsistent with the itinerary, while showing absolutely no traces of continued travel around it, began to change the authorities' perspective on the case. The search log was updated with notes emphasizing the anomaly of the vehicle's location, treating it as a major landmark, requiring deeper analysis rather than a minor detail. Field commanders requested precise recording of coordinates, time of discovery, and the condition of all items in the vehicle, while also sealing the vehicle to prevent disturbance of any potential evidence that might be valuable later. In internal discussions, several initial hypotheses were proposed to explain the change in the students' plan, including the possibility that they discovered a more interesting new survey site or were forced to reroute due to terrain conditions, but all of them faced difficulties when confronted with the complete absence of any further movement traces from the vehicle's location. The discovery of the vehicle, rather than providing clear leads, raised more questions instead, as it showed that the two students had deliberately stopped there but left no indication of their next direction or the reason for that decision. From this point onward, the case file began to be flagged with a higher level of attention, as the elements no longer fully aligned with the simple scenario of getting lost, although there was still insufficient evidence to classify it as criminal in nature. For the search team, the vehicle became the only confirmed anchor point in a picture still missing many pieces, and the complete lack of human traces around it forced the entire surrounding area to be re-evaluated with greater caution, laying the groundwork for reassessing the scope and methods of the search in the following days. After the student's vehicle was identified as the last verifiable point, authorities decided to adjust strategy by expanding the search area beyond the original perimeter, treating the vehicle's location as the new center for establishing a concentric circle search pattern. The range was extended several miles in all directions, including areas previously considered unlikely to be reached in a normal survey day, with the goal of ruling out the possibility that the students had traveled farther than expected for some unknown reason. Additional search teams were mobilized from neighboring areas, increasing the total personnel involved to a higher level, while also strengthening coordination among rangers, local police, and professional search and rescue units. In addition to continuing line-based foot sweeps, support vehicles began to be deployed to overcome the terrain and environmental limitations revealed in the early days. Helicopters were brought in for aerial observation, focusing on detecting anomalies such as man-made objects amid the natural landscape, unusual light reflections, or areas that could conceal injured persons. High-resolution camera drones were also used in narrow or hard-to-reach areas by foot, allowing rapid scanning of deep canyons and sheer cliffs that humans could not safely access. At the same time, canine search teams were brought to the scene in hopes of detecting any residual scent trails from the vehicle's location or from personal items confirmed to belong to the two students. However, the harsh environmental conditions of Chaco Canyon continued to pose major challenges as the dry, hard ground, strong winds, and large day-night temperature swings rapidly degraded scent retention, limiting the effectiveness of the dogs compared to more humid or forested environments. Parallel to the expanded ground search and rescue specialists began conducting a detailed assessment of the maximum survival time for the two students under the area's specific environmental conditions. Factors analyzed included the amount of water they could carry for a survey day, the possibility of accessing natural water sources within their travel radius, degree of shelter from sun and wind, and their field experience in handling emergency situations. Weather data for the days following their disappearance showed consistently high daytime temperatures with sharp drops at night, creating a large diurnal temperature range that could cause severe bodily stress without adequate shelter. Based on standard survival models, experts estimated that, under the best conditions, a well-prepared individual could survive outdoors for several days to over a week if water was available. But the risks of exhaustion, dehydration, and hypothermia would increase rapidly over time without access to support. For the two students, despite their experience and basic equipment, the fact that they never returned to the vehicle or lodging suggested they may have encountered an incident that significantly impaired their ability to self-protect and navigate. As days passed without new leads, internal reports began reflecting a shift in overall assessment from hope of finding the victims alive to preparing for worst-case scenarios. Each fruitless search day reduced the statistical survival probability used by rescue forces, and this was reflected in resource allocation and end-of-day evaluation meetings. Search teams continued working at high intensity, but simultaneously had to confront the reality that the vast environment and lack of specific clues made every effort resemble a search in empty space. Expanding the search area, while necessary, also increased the risk of missing small details due to the sheer size, forcing commanders to constantly balance depth versus breadth of operations. In that context, expert reports began to emphasize that the students' chances of survival were steadily decreasing day by day, not only because of environmental factors, but also due to the complete absence of any signs indicating active survival efforts or movement within the area. Although no official conclusion had yet been reached, the changing tone in internal assessments showed that the focus of the campaign was gradually shifting from expecting to find the victims safe to completing a thorough review of all reasonable possibilities, ensuring no area or scenario was overlooked during the expanded search. As the search campaign moved into a phase of deeper analysis, data collected from multiple days of field sweeps began to be compiled and cross-referenced to evaluate the plausibility of the lost in the wilderness hypothesis, and it was during this process that a series of inconsistent elements gradually became apparent. First and foremost, the complete absence of any continuing travel route originating from the vehicle's location emerged as the single largest anomaly. Because in most cases of lost persons, even when disoriented or panicked, some form of trace indicating initial direction of travel is usually left behind, especially within a few-mile radius of the starting point. At Chaco Canyon, despite the harsh terrain and soil that does not easily hold impressions, search teams still expected to find at least some indirect indicators such as disturbed rocks, abnormally broken branches, or unnatural changes in vegetation along spontaneous paths, but none appeared. Alongside this, the lack of any temporary shelter signs also weakened the hypothesis that the students had attempted to survive after an incident. Experienced field personnel typically prioritize finding or creating basic shelter when stranded, such as using rock faces to block wind, setting up tarp shelters, or utilizing natural rock alcoves to avoid sun and retain nighttime heat. However, the thoroughly searched areas around the vehicle and along plausible travel directions showed no signs of any shelter structure, whether rudimentary or incomplete. No evidence of fire-making, no ash residue, no rocks arranged in unusual ways, and no materials indicating an attempt to prolong survival in the outdoor environment. The absence of prolonged survival signs further heightened suspicion, because in missing persons cases lasting multiple days, lost individuals often leave evidence of efforts to stay alive, such as moving near water sources, gathering edible plants, or leaving trail markers to increase chances of detection. Search teams checked all reasonable natural water sources, including dry washes, rock basins that collect water, and low-lying areas capable of retaining moisture, but found no signs that the two students had ever approached or used these sources. These analyses were presented in internal evaluation meetings, where veteran search and rescue experts began comparing the case to typical wilderness missing persons incidents they had previously handled. Some SAR specialists noted that even in cases involving inexperienced individuals or panic states, there is usually a traceable chain of behavior, whether short or long, while here, the near-total absence of any human sign created a difficult-to-explain void. They also pointed out that both students were knowledgeable in archaeology and terrain, familiar with map reading and navigation devices, which reduced the likelihood that they would simultaneously become so disoriented as to leave no trace whatsoever. Additionally, the fact that the vehicle was abandoned in a location inconsistent with the registered itinerary, combined with the complete lack of subsequent travel evidence, created a logical contradiction within the lost in the wilderness hypothesis. It would require assuming the students deliberately changed plans but then vanished without leaving any indication of that decision. Analytical reports began using more cautious language, stressing that while there was still no direct evidence of criminal activity, the existing factors did not fully align with a typical accident or lost-in-wilderness scenario. The atypical nature of the case was highlighted through comparison with statistical data from previous missing persons incidents in national parks, where the vast majority of cases had at least some indicators to guide the search, even when the outcome was unfavorable. For the campaign commanders, these analyses did not mean an immediate change in the case's classification, but they forced authorities to acknowledge that initial assumptions were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain when confronted with on-site evidence. The lack of a travel route, absence of temporary shelter, and complete lack of prolonged survival signs gradually positioned the case as an outlier in the context of search and rescue, and although search operations continued, professional assessments at this stage began reflecting a significantly higher degree of uncertainty, laying the foundation for difficult decisions regarding future approach and resource allocation in the coming days of the campaign. After many days of continuous searching without obtaining any additional valuable field clues, the authorities were forced to enter the final evaluation phase to decide whether the active search campaign should continue. In a context where resources were increasingly stretched thin, and all survival indicators showed that the likelihood of finding the two students alive had dropped to a very low level. Meetings between the field commander, representatives of the ranger force, local police, and the search and rescue expert team focused on analyzing all collected data, from the coverage of searched areas, environmental conditions, to the complete absence of human signs such as travel routes, shelter sites, or evidence of prolonged survival. A cautious but consistent general conclusion was reached. All reasonably accessible areas within the maximum survival timeframe had been thoroughly searched with high intensity, and continuing active search using the same methods would be unlikely to yield new results, commensurate with the resources expended. On that basis, the decision to suspend active search was approved in accordance with standard procedures applied to missing persons cases in wilderness environments, while maintaining the ability to respond should any new information or clues emerge in the future. Terminating the search did not mean the case was resolved, but rather reflected the practical limits of rescue operations under conditions of scarce clues and the harsh environment of Chaco Canyon. Following this decision, the files of the two students were updated to presumed dead status, an administrative classification that allows authorities to close the search and rescue phase without requiring direct evidence of death, such as a body or remains. This status change also carried certain legal consequences for the victims' families, but within the scope of the authorities' handling, it reflected the professional assessment that the likelihood of the two students still being alive after the elapsed time was extremely low. More importantly, at that point, no element in the file was sufficient to trigger a formal criminal investigation, as there were no signs of violence, no evidence of physical assault, and no data indicating third-party intervention. The unusual factors recorded during the search were deemed not strong enough to meet the legal threshold of suspicion required to open a criminal case, especially given that many missing persons cases in national parks conclude without clear resolution. Thus, the case remained classified as a disappearance in a natural environment with an initial conclusion based on the hypothesis of accident or getting lost, leading to death. The complete file, including search maps, field reports, expert assessments, and operational decisions, was compiled and archived according to regulations, ready to be reopened if reliable new information emerges. For the personnel involved in the search, closing the campaign carried the heavy feeling of an unfulfilled mission, without a final answer regarding the fate of the two students. For the victims' families, the presumed dead conclusion was both official and left a difficult psychological void. Nevertheless, at that time, within the framework of available facts and the limitations of search operations, suspending the search and archiving the file was considered the only appropriate choice, according to established procedures and professional standards, marking the temporary placement of the missing persons case into closed file status, with no further investigative developments, gradually receding into the background of the routine operations of the responsible agencies. After the official search campaign ended, and the two students' files were changed to presumed dead status, time began to pass in the familiar way of unresolved missing persons cases. Public and media attention gradually faded, while the case receded into the background of the agency's filing systems. In the first few months, no new information or clues emerged, no reports of discovered evidence, remains, or signs related to the two students, either inside or outside the Chaco Canyon area. The responsible units periodically reviewed the file according to internal procedures, but all data matched what had been previously recorded, with no new elements strong enough to alter the initial conclusion. For law enforcement and rangers, the case was categorized among wilderness disappearance cases with undetermined outcomes, a not uncommon reality in vast remote national parks, where people can vanish without leaving clear traces. However, for the families of the two students, time brought no closure, only a prolonged state of uncertain waiting. Over the following years, they continued sending informal requests to the park management, local police and state-level agencies, asking for file review and questioning the unusual details recorded during the search, particularly the vehicle's location and the complete absence of survival traces. These requests were generally received and responded to according to administrative procedures, with responses affirming that the file remained archived and ready to be reopened with reliable new information. But in practice, no supplementary investigative actions were initiated. The lack of new information prevented the case from reaching the priority threshold needed to allocate additional resources, especially without criminal evidence or threats to public safety. Over time, personnel directly involved in the initial search were reassigned, field commanders changed, and memories of the disappearance gradually became part of internal history, rather than an actively monitored case. Paper files and electronic data were stored in agency archives, labeled as cold cases, accessed only upon specific request or during periodic reviews. Meanwhile, the victims' families continued their own independent efforts to seek information, contacting volunteer search groups, organizations specializing in missing persons, and even sharing their children's story in small communities, holding on to the faint hope that someone, somewhere, might have seen or known something related to the two students. However, all these efforts yielded no concrete results, and no credible reports were forwarded to authorities as grounds for reactivating the file. With each passing year, the absence of new developments gradually reinforced the case's status as administratively concluded, though never fully resolved in reality. Within the legal and investigative system, the file remained in a latent state, neither permanently closed nor actively processed, reflecting the balance between the duty to preserve information and the practical limits of resources. Throughout this period, no criminal investigation was reopened, no new search warrants were issued, no additional analysis of previously recorded anomalies was conducted, and the disappearance of the two archaeology students at Chaco Canyon continued to exist as an unanswered question, quietly resting in the cold case archives, waiting for an external factor strong enough to break that prolonged stillness. Nearly 5 years after the missing persons file was classified as cold, an unexpected event occurred at a regional hospital in the southwestern United States, when emergency staff admitted an individual in critical condition, showing signs of prolonged dehydration, severe malnutrition, and marked cognitive impairment. The person was found almost incapable of self-care, wearing worn-out clothing, with a body covered in overlapping old and new scars, and carrying no valid identification documents. During initial examination, when asked about their identity, the individual gave a name, matching one of the two archaeology students who had gone missing at Chaco Canyon years earlier, a detail already stored in both state and federal missing persons systems. Due to the person's frail health and unstable psychological state, the initial self-identification was cautiously recorded by medical staff as a possibility requiring verification rather than a definitive conclusion. When questioned about the other member of the two-student group, the individual provided no specific information, only displaying confusion and avoidance, neither confirming nor denying the other's survival, nor describing the circumstances that led to their separation. The immediate lack of information about the second victim was noted as a significant factor, since in cases where long missing persons return, there is usually at least some data about the journey or fate of companions. Doctors quickly observed that the individual's physical condition was inconsistent with someone who had been freely wandering for an extended period, as the degree of emaciation and certain injuries, suggested a phase of severe restriction in space and living conditions. Faced with these abnormalities, the hospital followed mandatory reporting procedures to law enforcement authorities, including local police and the unit responsible for missing persons cases, to verify identity and assess the legal nature of the situation. Preliminary information transmitted included the person's health status, self-reported identity, lack of identification documents, and the critical detail that the provided name matched a missing persons file previously concluded as presumed dead years earlier. This notification was handled as a sensitive matter, because if the self-identification proved accurate, it would mean reopening a years-old cold case, triggering a chain of investigative and legal consequences. While awaiting response from authorities, the individual was kept for aggressive medical treatment, with basic life support stabilization measures, and external contact was restricted to ensure safety and prevent information contamination in the early stage. Medical staff noted fearfulness when questioned about the past, stress reactions to certain environmental stimuli, and avoidance of questions related to the disappearance period, further raising suspicion that the past 5 years had not been a period of freedom or voluntary activity. When information about the case reached the competent authorities, rapid file cross-checking was initiated at a preliminary level, as the match in age, gender, and basic identifying features was sufficient to treat this as a serious possibility, requiring verification. The individual's reappearance in severely emaciated condition, without documents, unable to provide information about the other person, and appearing hundreds of miles from Chaco Canyon, created a major shock for officers who had originally handled the missing persons file, as this scenario lay entirely outside the assumptions made when the case was closed. During this phase, authorities focused on identity verification rather than detailed statement collection to avoid further harming the person's physical and psychological health, while ensuring all subsequent steps were based on verified data. This reappearance event, though not yet officially confirmed, was sufficient to change the file's status within the internal system from a cold missing persons case to an urgent follow-up situation. For the first time in many years, offering the possibility that one of the 2 archaeology students from Chaco Canyon might still be alive and had returned under circumstances no one could have anticipated. After the hospital transferred the initial information to the authorities, the identity confirmation process was activated at a high priority level, with the goal of clarifying whether the individual who had just reappeared was indeed one of the 2 students who had gone missing at Chaco Canyon or not. Before any investigative assumptions were made, the investigators coordinated with medical personnel to collect biological samples according to standard procedures, including blood samples, saliva samples, and fingerprints, while also recording detailed physical identification features such as height, bone structure, old scars, dental characteristics, and other specific body markers that could be compared with archived records. The sampling was conducted under strictly controlled conditions to ensure the accuracy and legal validity of the data, while minimizing to the maximum extent any negative impact on the individual's already weakened health condition. In parallel with that, the investigators retrieved the original missing persons files from the storage system, including biometric data that had been provided when the 2 students registered for research permits, academic records from the university, basic medical information, and previous identification documents provided by the victims' families. Fingerprints were compared with the federal database, while DNA samples were sent to a designated laboratory for comparison with reference samples stored from the families, which had been collected many years earlier during the initial search phase. The comparison process took place over a few days, with each step continuously updated to the relevant units, but still maintained at a high level of confidentiality to avoid information leaks before an official conclusion. During the waiting period for results, the investigators also conducted cross-checks of non-biological data, including rare medical history, injury history, treated dental characteristics, and identification factors that are difficult to change over time, to increase the reliability of the verification process. When the DNA analysis results were returned, they showed a near-absolute match with the family records of one of the two missing students, eliminating the possibility of confusion or identity fraud. Fingerprints and other biometric features also confirmed similarity with previously stored data, further reinforcing the conclusion that the individual being treated was indeed one of the two people who had been considered presumed dead in administrative records. After the results were reviewed and cross-verified by multiple independent units, the authorities officially confirmed the identity of the reappeared individual, simultaneously updating the file status in the system from presumed dead to located alive, a change with significant legal and investigative implications. The confirmation notice was sent to relevant agencies at the state and federal levels, as well as to the victim's family, in accordance with the information protocol for partially resolved long-term missing persons cases. The identity confirmation not only ended many years of uncertainty for the survivor's family, but also forced the investigative system to reconsider all previous assumptions about the disappearance. Immediately after the identity was officially confirmed, the original missing persons file was reopened in active status, with the recovery of all documents, reports, and data collected during the initial search phase to serve the reevaluation of the case in a completely new context. The investigation commanders noted that the reappearance of a victim after nearly 5 years not only refuted the hypothesis of death due to natural accident, but also raised a series of unanswered questions about what had happened during that time. However, at this stage, the focus of the authorities still concentrated on completing the identity confirmation process in a thorough and indisputable manner, ensuring that all subsequent steps were based on accurate and legal data foundations. The reopened file was assigned a high priority level, marking a significant turning point in the case, when for the first time in many years, the story of the two missing archaeology students at Chaco Canyon shifted from the static state of a cold file to a dynamic investigative situation led by the authentic existence of a survivor. After the survivor's identity was officially confirmed, the authorities' processing focus shifted to a comprehensive medical evaluation to determine the health condition and objectively reconstruct what this person's body had experienced throughout nearly 5 years of disappearance. A team of specialized doctors was assigned to conduct detailed examinations, including general physical assessment, in-depth blood tests, imaging diagnostics, and functional tests to determine the level of long-term damage. Initial results showed that the survivor suffered from severe malnutrition, with a body mass index much lower than the minimum safe level, significant muscle atrophy, especially in large muscle groups, reflecting a long-term restricted movement condition. Biochemical tests detected prolonged deficiencies in vitamin D and some other essential micronutrients, accompanied by abnormal changes in bone density, indicating that the body had undergone a very long period without adequate exposure to sunlight. The doctors noted that this level of deficiency was inconsistent with living outdoors in a desert environment like Chaco Canyon, where strong sunlight and exposure to natural light are almost unavoidable, even for someone intentionally hiding. In addition, signs on the skin and soft tissues also showed features that could not be explained by natural survival, including circular scars around the wrists and ankles, with shapes and positions consistent with having been restrained for a long time, along with old injuries that had healed unevenly, suggesting multiple repeated trauma phases. Some calluses and deformities on the hands and feet indicated restricted movement in confined spaces, contrary to the characteristics typically seen in people who have to walk long distances or move continuously in wilderness environments. The doctors also noted temporary vision impairment related to prolonged lack of natural light, along with circadian rhythm disorders, reflecting a living environment without a normal day-night cycle. When synthesizing the medical data, the expert team reached the conclusion that the survivor's condition was inconsistent with any natural survival scenario over nearly 5 years, even in the most favorable conditions. On the contrary, the physical and biochemical signs all pointed to the person having been severely restricted in space, light, and mobility, while being maintained at a minimal level of sustenance sufficient to prolong existence. This conclusion was compiled into a detailed medical report, emphasizing that the findings could not be explained by accident, getting lost in the woods, or voluntary seclusion, but were more consistent with a scenario of controlled confinement in a closed environment. The report also noted that the existence of long-term restraint traces indicated intentional human intervention, with a level of organization sufficient to maintain the victim in a living but debilitated state, which far exceeded all initial assumptions of the missing persons file. When the medical report was transferred to the investigators in charge of the case, it immediately became a key basis for reconsidering the legal nature of the entire case. Based on the conclusion that the survivor could not have self-sustained in a natural environment over the elapsed time, the authorities officially eliminated the hypothesis of accident or getting lost in the woods, while determining that the case showed clear signs of criminal activity. The file was reclassified from a long-term missing persons case to an investigation direction of kidnapping and unlawful detention, leading to adjustments in handling jurisdiction and approach methods. This decision marked a significant turning point, as for the first time since the two students disappeared, the case was viewed no longer as a tragedy in the wilderness, but as a deliberate crime, with the victims being those who had been deprived of freedom for a long time. The reclassification also allowed investigators to use deeper legal and investigative tools, including data access rights, artifact analysis, and expanding the scope of verifying related individuals, although at this point, the focus was still on completing the medical evaluation and ensuring the survivor's safety. From an investigative perspective, the medical report was not only evidence of health condition, but also the first piece proving that what had happened during nearly 5 years of disappearance was not the result of natural circumstances, but the consequence of a chain of intentional actions, laying the foundation for transitioning the case to a comprehensive criminal investigation phase. In parallel with the medical evaluation process, and after the case was reclassified in the direction of kidnapping and detention, the investigative agency proceeded to inventory all items that the survivor carried upon reappearance, considering this as a rare source of material data that could directly reflect the environment the victim had experienced during the disappearance period. The inventory was conducted under strictly controlled conditions, with the participation of investigators, forensic experts, and artifact handling officers to ensure every detail was accurately recorded. Besides the clothing on the person and some simple personal items, the authorities discovered a small group of artifacts that the survivor had carefully kept in the luggage, with shapes, materials, and levels of finish unlike any ordinary household items. These artifacts included pieces of hard material with roughly machined surfaces, some pieces of stone or minerals ground into specific shapes, and small structures whose functions could not be immediately determined. Notably, none of these artifacts matched the list of personal items that the two students were recorded as carrying before disappearing, indicating they had been collected or accessed during the time they were out of contact with the outside world. When preliminarily asked about the origin of the artifacts, the survivor did not provide clear information, only showing a reserved attitude and not offering specific explanations about where they came from or what they were used for, forcing the investigative agency to rely entirely on specialized analysis instead of statements. The artifacts were transferred to the laboratory for material analysis, including checks of mineral composition, microstructure, and processing traces, to determine geological origins, as well as the level of human intervention. Initial analysis results showed that some artifacts were made from types of stone or materials not common in thoroughly researched archaeological areas in the southwestern United States, while others bore signs of processing that did not follow the traditional crafting techniques of recorded indigenous cultures. To expand comparisons, the investigative agency sent detailed information and images of the artifacts to many independent experts in the fields of archaeology, geology, and museology, including research institutes and large artifact storage facilities, to determine if they matched any artifacts that had been excavated, stored, or recorded in museum systems. The responses received were consistent on a notable point, that none of these artifacts fit known classifications in terms of age, crafting techniques, or cultural context. Some experts opined that the artifacts did not bear clear characteristics of fake antiques or commercial products, and also did not resemble reported lost archaeological artifacts, making the possibility that they were stolen from museums or storage very low. The inability to determine the official origin of the artifacts increased their investigative value, as in the context of a long-term kidnapping and detention case, any object closely associated with the victim during the disappearance could reflect the detention environment or areas the victim had contact with. The investigators began considering the possibility that these artifacts were not randomly collected by the victim, but may have been brought from the detention site, either accidentally or through some mechanism not yet clarified. Deeper analysis of mineral composition showed that some artifacts had features consistent with very specific geological areas not widely distributed, allowing the investigative agency to begin narrowing down potential areas where the materials could originate. Additionally, processing traces on the artifact surfaces showed they were handled without modern tools, but also not entirely consistent with primitive techniques commonly seen in ancient indigenous communities, creating an inexplicable gap in the crafting context. From an investigative perspective, the existence of these unidentified origin artifacts was evaluated as a significant turning point. As for the first time, the case not only relied on statements or the victim's physical condition, but also had specific material evidence linked to the disappearance period. The investigators agreed that, although the function or meaning of each artifact could not yet be concluded, they had the potential to serve as location clues reflecting where the victim had been detained, or at least areas the victim had contact with for a long time. Therefore, the artifacts were sealed, filed separately, and included in the list of key evidence with strict preservation requirements for further analyses. The fact that the artifacts did not match any known museum systems or archaeological data made them an independent factor, not bound by old assumptions, while opening a new approach for the investigative agency in efforts to determine the real context of the disappearance period. At this stage, the artifacts were not considered conclusive evidence, but were seen as rare anchor points in a story with many gaps, where each material detail could lead to identifying the space, conditions, and context where the victim had been deprived of freedom, thereby playing a key role in shaping the next direction of the entire investigation. Based on the fact that the artifacts seized from the survivor were identified as rare material clues directly linked to the period of disappearance, the investigating agency decided to deploy a specialized in-depth tracing branch focused entirely on material analysis to determine the geographic space from which these artifacts could have originated. This process began by breaking down each artifact into small samples for analysis of mineral composition, crystal structure, and trace impurities, with the goal of identifying the distinctive geological fingerprint of each sample. The participating geological laboratories determined that some artifacts contained rare mineral assemblages that seldom occur together, including specific variants of sandstone, shale, and trace mineral grains that only form under very particular geological conditions. These results were immediately cross-referenced with the Federal Geological Database, including detailed geological maps of the southwestern United States, which record the distribution of rock layers, mineral deposits, and geological structures by sub-region. The cross-referencing showed that the mineral assemblages in the artifacts were not widely distributed, but appeared only in a few scattered areas, many of which lie outside regular tourist routes or officially designated archaeological research zones. The consulting geologists advised the investigation that, within hundreds of square miles around Chaco Canyon, only a small number of areas have sufficiently similar geological compositions to produce artifacts with these characteristics. And these areas are typically associated with difficult-to-access natural features such as deep canyons, abandoned mines, or rock formations off the regular trail system. In parallel with the geological analysis, the investigating agency conducted a review of human activity data related to these potential areas, including historical mining records, abandoned structures, and locations previously used for unofficial purposes outside strict national park management oversight. This review aimed to rule out the possibility that the artifacts originated from easily accessible or frequently trafficked areas, as that would be inconsistent with the hypothesis of prolonged secret confinement. As the data layers were overlaid, including mineral composition, geological maps, and information on human accessibility, the scope of suspicion began to narrow significantly, from a vast area spanning multiple counties down to a few specific high-compatibility points. Among these points, one area stood out due to the convergence of multiple factors, including near-perfect geological composition match with the artifacts, relative isolation, and the presence of natural or man-made structures capable of creating enclosed spaces. Investigators noted that this area fell outside the initial search grids of the multi-year SAR campaign, as it was not within the expected travel range of the two students and was not part of popular trail systems. To verify the hypothesis, geological experts conducted more detailed comparisons between the artifact samples and rock samples collected from the suspected area, focusing on ratios of rare trace minerals and crystal structures formed under specific pressure and temperature conditions. The comparison results showed such a high degree of similarity that it was difficult to consider it coincidental, strongly supporting the possibility that at least some of the artifacts had direct contact with or were made from materials in this area. Additionally, tool marks on the artifacts were analyzed in relation to the geological conditions, indicating they may have been processed on-site using rudimentary tools or in a restricted environment rather than transported from elsewhere. These combined factors elevated the priority level of the suspected area in the investigation list, transforming it from one possibility among many into a highly probable point of relevance. The investigating agency established a dedicated file for this area, including detailed maps, geological data, land use history, and accessibility assessments, while also evaluating potential risks for any future on-site deployment. Identifying a high-probability location did not equate to concluding it was the site of confinement, but in the absence of other direct clues, it provided a specific scientifically grounded direction rather than continuing a broad, unfocused investigation. For the investigators, this was the first time since the case was reopened that they could connect physical evidence to a specific geographic space, creating a tangible link between the artifacts, the environment, and the confinement hypothesis. Narrowing the scope of suspicion to a focal point allowed subsequent steps to be prepared systematically based on objective data rather than speculation, marking a significant shift in the investigation from indirect analysis to the identification of a specific site that could prove pivotal in explaining the prolonged disappearance period of the two archaeology students. Access to the suspected site was carried out after the investigating agency completed all necessary legal procedures and developed an operational plan suited to the terrain's unique characteristics, as the area lies deep within a canyon region, rarely marked on tourist maps, with no direct motorized vehicle access, and reachable only by many hours of foot travel over steep, loose, and landslide-prone rocky terrain. The access team, consisting of criminal investigators, geologists, crime scene forensic technicians, and safety support personnel, was deployed in small groups to minimize environmental impact and avoid disturbing potential evidence. Upon reaching the central area of the suspected point, the team documented the existence of a semi-natural structure formed by the combination of natural cliff walls and artificial elements, creating an enclosed space with a narrow, hard-to-observe entrance from the outside and virtually undetectable unless approached from a specific angle. This structure did not appear on any construction maps or prior survey records, indicating it was not part of any permitted or officially documented facility. After ensuring safety and confirming no current human presence, the technical team proceeded inside and quickly determined that the space was divided into several small chambers, each showing signs of use for different purposes over an extended period. The rock surfaces within the enclosed space exhibited numerous unusual wear patterns inconsistent with natural processes, including parallel scratches, repeated impact marks, and smoother surface areas around fixed points, suggesting regular human habitation activity. The structure's limited natural ventilation system indicated that natural light could only enter for short periods each day, consistent with prior medical conclusions regarding the victim's prolonged light deprivation. During the examination, investigators discovered multiple signs of sustained habitation, indicating the long-term presence of at least one person, including residues from small fire pits, thin accumulated ash layers over time, slowly decomposing organic material fragments, and rudimentary water storage traces created by utilizing natural rock hollows. These indicators did not suggest temporary presence or short-term shelter, but reflected an organized, albeit minimal, survival pattern extending over multiple years. As the interior areas were separated, the examination team observed that the space was implicitly divided into different functional zones, including a main living area with signs of sleeping resting, a secondary area with traces of rudimentary food preparation, and a more isolated area with fewer movement traces, likely used for confinement or isolation. This separation was not based on complete artificial partitions, but was achieved through rock arrangement, location selection, and movement direction, indicating that whoever controlled the space had some understanding of organizing living conditions in a restricted environment. Several physical indicators, including indentations in the rock at heights corresponding to human hand positions, concentrated wear marks around fixed points, and the presence of materials used to restrict movement, were recorded as consistent with confinement behavior. Crime scene forensic specialists documented each area in detail, taking photographs, creating spatial diagrams, and collecting samples for later analysis, while ensuring the spatial relationships between traces were preserved. During this process, no evidence was found suggesting the space had been used for ceremonial, touristic, or legitimate research purposes, ruling out the possibility that this was an archaeological site or natural shelter used incidentally. The structure's characteristics, including its hidden location, controlled access-egress capability, and presence of controlled habitation traces, reinforced the assessment that this was a deliberately chosen site for long-term human confinement without detection. The confirmation of this enclosed structure marked the first time the investigation could directly link medical conclusions and physical evidence to a specific physical space, enabling reconstruction of the living conditions the victim endured. Throughout the examination process, investigators maintained a cautious approach, noting that any error in evaluating the scene could result in the loss of critical evidence related to the methods of confinement and victim control. Upon completion of the initial access and examination phase, the area was sealed and placed under surveillance to protect the scene while facilitating further in-depth analysis based on the collected data. During the expanded examination of the enclosed area, after completing the recording of habitation and confinement traces, the investigation team conducted a thorough review of deeper chambers beyond the initial line of sight, where the terrain sloped downward with no signs of frequent movement, and there they discovered unusual organic decomposition traces beneath a thin layer of naturally accumulated sediment over time. After delineating the area and implementing scene preservation protocols, forensic technicians confirmed the presence of human remains in an advanced state of decomposition, indicating death had occurred many years earlier. The remains were found in a separate space, distinct from the main living area, with no signs of ritual burial, and were superficially covered with loose rock fragments, suggesting the concealment was reactive rather than part of a formal burial plan. The location's characteristics indicated it was more difficult to access, had extremely low light, and was unsuitable for long-term survival, consistent with the hypothesis that this was where the second victim died during the period of confinement. The recovery of the remains was conducted in stages, with close coordination between scene investigators and forensic anthropologists to maximize preservation of remaining structural elements, including long bones, skull, and small bone fragments prone to disturbance. After transfer to the examination facility, the forensic analysis focused on identification, time since death, and cause of death, given that the harsh environmental conditions had significantly altered soft tissue and bone preservation. Initial anthropological comparison showed morphological characteristics consistent with the biological profile of the second missing student, including estimated age, skeletal structure, and certain dental features previously recorded in medical records. Microscopic bone analysis and biological stress markers indicated the victim had endured prolonged malnutrition, mineral imbalance, and repeated limb bone trauma consistent with restricted survival conditions in a confinement environment. On several ribs and forearm bones, experts noted evidence of incompletely healed fractures, indicating injuries occurred prior to death and went without proper medical treatment. Determining the cause of death was challenging due to the degree of decomposition. However, forensic indicators allowed exclusion of immediate death from natural accident or self-inflicted injury. No evidence of fatal weapon wounds was found in the final stage, but biological markers strongly suggested death resulted from a combination of factors, including physical exhaustion, untreated infection, and prolonged adverse environmental conditions. Time of death was estimated to fall within 1 to 2 years after the two students went missing, based on decomposition level, sediment accumulation, and regional environmental data, indicating the victim had survived a significant period after being confined before dying. This conclusion is particularly important as it reinforces the assessment that both victims were held for an extended time, and the second victim's death occurred in the context of confinement rather than at the initial moment of disappearance. The confirmation of death during confinement allowed investigators to establish a clearer timeline for the sequence of events, while eliminating the possibility that the victim died early on due to a terrain accident. Following completion of the examination, the identity of the second victim was officially confirmed through comparison of biological records with family data, closing years of uncertainty for relatives while simultaneously opening a new phase of investigation focused on clarifying the circumstances leading to the death. The forensic report concluded that the second victim's death was a direct consequence of prolonged confinement conditions, lack of medical care, and survival control, thereby officially confirming that the case involved not only one survivor, but also a death occurring during unlawful detention. After confirming the existence of a detention site and the death of the second victim during captivity, the focus of the investigation shifted to identifying the individual or group of individuals capable of carrying out the abduction and maintaining control over the area for an extended period without detection. Investigators began by retrieving all individuals who had legal or practical access to the suspected area during the time the two students went missing, and in the following years, including federal land management personnel, maintenance contractors, private research groups that had obtained nearby survey permits, seasonal grazing permit holders, as well as individuals living scattered in nearby remote areas. The initial list included dozens of people, but was quickly narrowed based on criteria such as frequent access, deep knowledge of canyon terrain, and repeated presence during time periods inconsistent with declared activities. Positioning data from vehicle records, restricted area entry/exit logs, permit applications, and telecommunications data were cross-referenced to identify anomalous movement patterns. During this process, investigators identified one individual who appeared near the suspected area with significantly higher frequency than documented work requirements would explain, including multiple visits during off-duty hours and during periods when no permitted tourism or research activities were taking place. Behavioral records showed this individual had long-term experience working in wilderness environments, possessed survival skills, understood concealed access routes, and had the ability to maintain prolonged presence without drawing attention. Cross-referencing this person's movement history with the timeline of the disappearances revealed significant coincidences, including vehicle signals and fuel transactions recorded near the Chaco Canyon area immediately before and after the two students vanished, as well as during later periods when active searching had ceased. In parallel with movement analysis, investigators conducted a review of the individual's personal history, including criminal records, history of violent behavior, civil complaints, and reports related to controlling or intrusive conduct toward others. Although there were no serious prior convictions, records showed prior reports of unauthorized entry into restricted areas and a tendency toward isolation and avoidance of prolonged social contact. More importantly, several indirect witnesses, including scattered residents in the area, provided information that they had seen this person transporting supplies and food in quantities disproportionate to personal needs, as well as observing lights or smoke coming from the canyon area at unusual times over many years, but had not reported it because they assumed it was legitimate personal survival activity. When this data was synthesized, the investigative team began considering potential motives, focusing on elements of control, power, and the ability to conceal behavior in an isolated environment, rather than financial or impulsive motives. Behavioral psychological analysis revealed a pattern of prolonged, minimally organized, but stable detention, consistent with the behavior of an individual accustomed to isolated living and control over confined spaces. The absence of ransom demands, lack of contact with victims' families, and no signs of seeking material gain reinforced the assessment that the motive was not economic, but likely related to the need to control people and living environments. When physical traces at the detention site were compared with tools, materials, and living methods familiar to the potential suspect, experts noted numerous similarities, including spatial arrangement, techniques for utilizing rocky terrain, and methods of sustaining life under deprivation conditions. While these individual matches were not sufficient on their own for charges, when placed within the overall framework of temporal, spatial, and behavioral data, they formed a clear and logical chain of connections. After presenting the analysis results to the Interagency Investigative Board, authorities unanimously designated the aforementioned individual as the primary suspect in the case based on long-term exclusive access capability, coincidence in movement history, matching behavioral indicators, and indirect links to on-site traces. Identifying the primary suspect did not equate to a final conclusion of criminal responsibility, but marked a significant shift from field investigation to individual-focused investigation, allowing functional units to concentrate resources on collecting direct evidence, strengthening the case file, and preparing for subsequent legal steps based on a specific subject rather than the previously broad hypothetical scope. After the primary suspect was established based on the synthesis of access, behavioral, and crime scene trace data, authorities executed an approved arrest warrant, conducting simultaneous operations at the residence and other suspected locations to prevent evidence destruction. The suspect was safely taken into custody, and items related to wilderness survival, hand tools, lighting equipment, and the vehicle that had appeared in cross-reference data were seized. During initial interrogation, investigators focused on reconstructing the criminal sequence along the established timeline from crime scene and medical records, beginning with the phase of approaching the two students at the legal research area, where the suspect could exploit terrain knowledge and familiar status to make contact without arousing suspicion. Based on statements and indirect evidence, the suspect approached at the end of the research day, using information about routes and return times to offer transportation assistance, thereby creating conditions to isolate the victims from safe routes. The abduction phase was reconstructed by cross-referencing vehicle traces, unusual stopping locations, and abandoned personal items, showing that the two students were forced to deviate from their original plan in a short time frame without opportunity to send a distress signal. The subsequent chain of events showed the suspect leading the victims to a pre-prepared enclosed structure, choosing difficult-to-observe access routes, and tightly controlling entry-exit, consistent with recorded spatial control traces. The detention phase was reconstructed in greater detail by combining fragmented statements from the survivor with long-term activity traces at the scene, including area partitioning, restricted lighting rhythms, and movement control methods. Wear marks, anchor points, and materials limiting movement were compared with seized tools, showing similarity in techniques and usage habits. Cross-referencing statements with medical records reinforced findings of prolonged light deprivation, malnutrition, and repeated trauma, consistent with controlled but medically unsupported detention conditions. The disposal phase was cautiously reconstructed based on forensic examination of the second victim and skeletal location, showing that after the victim's health deteriorated, the suspect moved the body to a deeper chamber, covered it superficially to avoid detection, while continuing to hold the surviving victim in harsh conditions. During confrontation sessions, inconsistencies in the suspect's statements were clarified by cross-referencing telecommunications data, movement logs, physical traces, and material analysis results from the scene. Details about timing of appearances, methods of transporting water and food, and waste handling all matched collected traces, narrowing explanatory gaps. The reconstruction also clarified that the suspect sought no financial benefit or ransom contact, instead sustaining the behavior over a long period by exploiting the isolated environment, survival skills, and lack of oversight after active searching ended. This explained why the conduct went undetected for many years. Controlled crime scene reconstructions were conducted with forensic technicians and behavioral experts to test the feasibility of each step according to statements. Results showed that the approach abduction, detention, disposal sequence had high consistency with physical evidence from vehicle stopping points, movement traces, enclosed structure, to living conditions, and trace distribution in space. The final pieces were completed when seized items matched on-site traces, including wear patterns, cut marks, and repeated use signatures, ruling out random coincidence. At the conclusion of this phase, investigators completed a solidly evidence-based reconstruction of the criminal behavior, sufficient to present to the prosecuting authority, while ensuring all conclusions rested on multi-source cross-verification between statements and physical evidence, creating a legal foundation for subsequent proceedings. After completing the investigation file and reconstructing the criminal acts with a consistent system of physical, biological evidence and testimonies, the prosecution officially filed criminal charges against the suspect on multiple serious counts, including organized kidnapping, prolonged unlawful detention, physical and mental torture, and murder during the commission of the crime, with the indictment emphasizing the deliberate, prolonged, and exceptionally brutal nature of the conduct. The prosecution file was submitted to the state-level court, where jurisdiction was determined based on the location of the criminal acts and their direct consequences for the victims. During the pretrial phase, the prosecution team focused on strengthening the legality of the entire evidence collection process, from the detention site, forensic examinations, material analysis, to the surviving victim's testimony, while simultaneously rebutting defense motions to exclude evidence. The trial commenced after the panel of judges confirmed the file met the requirements for trial, drawing significant public attention due to the rare nature of a prolonged kidnapping and detention case in a wilderness environment. During the trial, the prosecution presented a tightly linked chain of evidence along a timeline, beginning with the moment that two students went missing, the initial search that found no trace, the reappearance of one victim, and finally, the discovery of the detention site and the remains of the second victim. Forensic experts, anthropologists, geologists, and behavioral analysts testified in turn, explaining to the jury the connections between crime scene traces, the medical condition of the victims, and the defendant's ability to control the detention space. The surviving victim's testimony, presented carefully to avoid further psychological harm, played a pivotal role in reconstructing the detention conditions, forced daily routines, and prolonged control imposed by the defendant, while being directly cross-referenced with physical traces collected at the scene. The defense focused on questioning the circumstantial nature of some evidence, arguing that the harsh environment may have contributed to the second victim's death and attempting to mitigate criminal responsibility by emphasizing the lack of proof of immediate killing behavior. However, this argument was countered by the prosecution with forensic conclusions demonstrating a direct causal relationship between the forced detention conditions and the victim's death, as well as evidence that the defendant continued to control and maintain the detention even after the victim's health deteriorated significantly. In the closing arguments, the prosecution emphasized that the case was not a series of accidents or individual mistakes, but the result of a deliberate, sustained pattern of behavior over many years with complete disregard for human life and dignity. After several days of deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict finding the defendant guilty on all major charges, with the central focus being felony murder during the commission of kidnapping and detention, a charge carrying the most severe penalty under state law. The jury's verdict was announced in open court, marking the end of the trial phase and the transition to sentencing. At the sentencing hearing, the court considered aggravating factors, including the prolonged duration of the crime, the severe physical and psychological harm inflicted on the victims, the death of one victim under detention conditions, and the defendant's exploitation of an isolated environment to conceal the offenses. The court also noted the long-term impact of the case on the victims' families and the community, particularly the prolonged suffering caused by years without answers. After considering the entire file and legal recommendations, the judge sentenced the defendant to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, affirming that this punishment accurately reflects the exceptionally serious nature of the conduct and the need to protect society from the risk of recidivism. The sentence was read in a solemn atmosphere, closing a lengthy but necessary legal process to ensure full accountability for what occurred, while establishing a clear legal precedent for prolonged kidnapping and detention cases in wilderness environments. After the sentence of life without parole was pronounced and all post-trial legal procedures were completed, attention shifted to assessing the long-term consequences for all involved parties and the current status of the case. The survivor was transferred to an intensive, long-term medical care and rehabilitation program focused on treating chronic malnutrition, metabolic disorders due to prolonged lack of light, accumulated musculoskeletal injuries, and neurological sequelae resulting from years of confinement in an enclosed environment. Physicians noted slow but steady physical progress, with rehabilitation protocols adjusted phase by phase to minimize re-injury and complication. Psychologically, the survivor entered long-term therapy to address post-traumatic stress disorder, sleep disturbances, fear responses to confined spaces, and symptoms related to prolonged social isolation. The therapy was conducted cautiously, prioritizing safety and privacy while avoiding re-traumatization. Although many challenges remain, experts assess partial reintegration as feasible in the medium term, provided continuous medical and psychological support is maintained. For the family of the second victim, the confirmation of identity and cause of death closed years of uncertainty, though it did not erase the loss. They participated in procedures to reclaim the remains, organized the funeral according to family wishes, and accessed psychological support resources for relatives of victims of serious crimes. In official statements following the trial, the family acknowledged the significance of the verdict in establishing legal accountability and ending the risk of recidivism, while stressing the need for improved monitoring in isolated areas to prevent similar cases. Legally, the sentence took effect after the appeal deadlines expired, with no change to the core verdict. The defendant was transferred to a high-security correctional facility as required, with a long-term management file reflecting the no-parole sentence. Remaining evidence was stored according to preservation standards for forensic research and training purposes, while the detention site was handled under a controlled preservation plan that both protects the historical evidentiary value of the case and ensures public safety. Authorities issued a summary report, systematizing investigative lessons regarding prolonged missing persons cases, risk assessment in isolated terrain, and case reclassification procedures when a victim reappears after a long period. This report has been used to update operational guidelines for search and rescue units and criminal investigators, emphasizing the importance of maintaining open communication channels with families even after a case changes status. Administratively, the case file was marked closed after all legal obligations were fulfilled, fully archived, and given restricted access rights to ensure data integrity and privacy of the parties involved. Closing the file does not mean the end of social responsibility. Victim support programs continue to be maintained, and policy recommendations have been forwarded to federal land management agencies for consideration. At present, the case is considered legally resolved, with one surviving victim on the path to recovery and one victim confirmed deceased during detention, while the defendant serves the maximum penalty provided by law. This status reflects the necessary conclusion of the judicial process while leaving lasting medical, psychological, and policy consequences that all parties involved must continue to face in the long term. The story of the two archaeology students who disappeared in Chaco Canyon and what happened afterward directly reflects many very real issues in contemporary American society, particularly trust in the safety of public spaces, the way the system handles prolonged missing persons cases, and the gap between the assumption of natural risk and deliberate criminality. In the story, the initial classification of the disappearance as having no criminal element illustrates a familiar reality in the vast wilderness areas of the United States. From national parks to remote federal lands, people tend to assume the greatest danger comes only from nature. This very assumption enabled the perpetrator to exploit the isolation, prematurely end searches, and maintain detention for years without detection due to lack of follow-up monitoring. The lesson here is not only for law enforcement, but also for communities and families. Continuing to ask questions, keeping records active, and not allowing missing persons cases to go completely cold can make a life or death difference, as demonstrated by how the reappearance of one victim forced the system to re-examine all prior conclusions. The story also underscores the importance of post-traumatic care in the United States, where survivors need not only rescue, but a long-term network of medical, psychological, and legal support to truly recover. Finally, the sentence of life without parole for the perpetrator reflects a core value in American legal culture. Individual freedom exists only so long as it does not violate the life and dignity of others. From Chaco Canyon, the takeaway is that vigilance, community responsibility, and the system's capacity for correction are the decisive factors in ensuring justice is not buried by time and terrain. If you feel the Chaco Canyon story shows that truth can sometimes be buried very deep, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue following cases that time and terrain once concealed. Thank you for accompanying us to the end of this journey, and we'll see you in the next video, where every opened file reminds us that justice should never be forgotten.